If you like this video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1 a month, your name can appear at the beginning of this and many other upcoming videos. Long ago, in a time before the rise of the internet, there was an animated show unlike any other, one that made a historical impact on comedy while bringing joy and laughter to millions around the world. It became a cultural phenomenon that lives on to this day, that many consider to be one of the greatest cartoons of all time. And that show is not what we're discussing today, because instead we're talking about Family Guy. Now, this isn't to say Family Guy wasn't a good show, because there really was a time where it was. I'd even say there was a time that its quality rivaled that of earlier seasons of The Simpsons. Perhaps not on an emotional level, but it was a wholesome show with relatable characters and a really fresh sense of humor. But for the longest time, people have been feeling the need to make parallels between the two shows, trying to determine which one is truly superior. Obviously it's The Simpsons, but there's still always been that sense of rivalry between both shows, where they say one is funnier or that one had better stories. I personally never cared for this rivalry because both shows just played a really significant part of my childhood. You could make the argument that I'm just going by nostalgic bias, but watching Family Guy when I was younger was one of my favorite pastimes. It had a sense of humor different from The Simpsons, but was able to stand out in a unique way because of how creative and quick-witted it could be. One thing that I always loved about this show was how it was able to be more adult than The Simpsons, obviously aimed at an older audience with more adult jokes, while still maintaining a lighthearted sense of humor. It wasn't trying to be dark and edgy for no reason, it was just trying to be its own thing, and it was all the more successful for it. And another thing that made this show so much fun is that it did have a great cast of characters. There was something interesting about them in that they had their flaws while still maintaining a unique charm. I still rewatch earlier seasons of the show from time to time, and I really wasn't expecting the nostalgia for it to hold up so well. I loved the earlier seasons of the show as a kid, but looking back on them as an adult, I realized how I never really appreciated how actually good it was. There was even episodes that delved into the more human aspects of the characters while maintaining a consistent tone. So it felt like you were watching a real dysfunctional family with a more satirical edge to it, much like The Simpsons was in its prime. But regardless of where you stand on the rivalry over which show was better, there's one universal fact that both sides can agree on. After a while, both shows started to suck. And not only suck, but suck really hard. It was pretty much the same situation in that the majority of the writing team that made the earlier seasons of the show so good eventually disbanded and moved on to other things, which resulted in them losing their charm and creative comedic writing. And they're also both seen as cash cows by Fox, who will do everything in their power to keep both franchises alive long after they became rotting corpses. But while the seasonal rot of The Simpsons was something that came to people's minds over time, Family Guy seasonal rot was infamously blatant at a much earlier date. Needless to say, the modern era of Family Guy is pretty infamous and has gained a reputation by a lot of people as a golden example of seasonal rot. And it's really easy to see why, because holy shit did Family Guy go downhill. All of the characters were stripped of their charm and unique characteristics, making everyone into a monstrous sociopath. The comedy just became repetitive and derivative to the point that they started telling the exact same jokes in every single episode. The pacing of the stories are absolutely terrible, with an overabundance of cutaway gags taking up too much of the episode's runtime while rushing the actual story with ill-timed jokes. And it took a really dark and edgy turn where it dialed up its black comedy far too much. It's the kind of black comedy where they have the characters acting horrible for no reason without a place bloody and gory violence. And it's not supported by anything clever, so it just comes across as needlessly cruel. And don't even get me started on the excessive amount of gross out this show's been putting out, where they just reference poop and boogers and flatulence every 5 minutes because poop and boogers and flatulence is funny. Right? No, it's not. It's just vulgar. So yeah, Family Guy became really bad over time, but there's always been this point of discussion in which people have their own idea for when the show started to suck. Some say it was season 7 after the infamous Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, which was really pretentious in just about every way. Others say it was season 10 after Screams of Silence, where the show treated domestic abuse with about as much tact and grace as a dog driving a monster truck on the expressway at top speed with the brakes cut. There are people who say it was in season 12 after they pulled the most emotionally manipulative ratings trap in television history by killing off Brian just to revive him 2 episodes later. And then you have the I told you so crowd who claims that the show was terrible all along, and that all the bullshit popped your bubble and helped you realize it. Needless to say, everyone had their own breaking point with this show, and today we're gonna talk about mine. What I personally consider to be the worst episode of Family Guy ever made. The one that made me finally give up on this garbage and never look back. And it's all thanks in part to this asshole.
I know words, I have the best words.
I have had enough of you!
And I know what you might be thinking. What? this episode, the one where they make fun of the most hated president in recent history because he deserves to be made fun of, you consider this episode to be worse than Life of Brian or Screams of Silence or Christmas Guy or Not All Dogs Go to Heaven or Herbie the Love Sore or Brian's a Bad Father or that episode that Dulsmick covered on his channel? Yes, as a matter of fact, I do. Now don't get me wrong, all of those episodes are terrible and represent some of the worst aspects of modern Family Guy. But I feel like what makes this episode stand out from all the others is how it fails in a more unique way. It begins with the Griffin family being called to Washington after Peter is hired by Trump to be his secretary. And for a huge chunk of the episode, nothing happens. There's no story, no constructed narrative, it's just going through a checklist of every single Trump joke imaginable. And I mean every single one. Every Trump joke that you can possibly think of that was getting old even before he became president is in this episode. And that's basically the entire theme, just making Trump jokes that have long since stopped being funny. Oh, he has weird looking hair. Oh, he has orange tan skin. Oh, he has small looking hands. Oh, he's trying to hide how he's secretly not as rich and doesn't have as much money as he says he does. Oh, he sexually assaulted a woman. Oh, he has a raspy voice that people like to purposefully do a bad impression of. Oh, his son is an idiot. Oh, he drinks Diet Coke. Oh, he's sucking up to Russia while they're hacking our information. Oh, he plays golf. Oh, he does silly stuff with his lips. Oh, he made incestuous comments about his daughter. Oh, a reference to his locker room talk about grabbing her by the... You know that Showtime program, Our Cartoon President, where the entire show is just Trump joke after Trump joke for the entirety of its run, where it heavily relies on you being extremely left-wing to find it funny, otherwise it's just a giant waste of time? Yeah, imagine an entire episode of Family Guy like that. It's just the writers going, let's see how many Trump jokes we can cram into 20 minutes. It's the equivalent of that terrible song number from The Simpsons, where you have to be someone who really hates Trump in order to find this shit funny. It's a giant black hole of comedy that panders to liberals and Democrats, and there's no subtlety to how any of these jokes are delivered. Maybe these could work as one-off gags if they put more thought into them, but they have no substance here. And the entire episode is oversaturated with these jokes from beginning to end. Did you find the first Trump joke funny? No? Well, too bad, because we got about 50 more of them. The problem isn't just that the Trump jokes are overdone, they're also just uncreative and lazy. Extremely lazy. Trump jokes have just become the easiest and most amateurish jokes that a comedian can make because you don't have to put any effort into them. Just say something about this politician and someone somewhere will find it funny. Mocking Trump has just become such a standard over the last couple of years that it's now the most unoriginal and cliché thing a comedian can do. Yes, he has weird hair and small hands and orange skin. It's not funny anymore. It's just lousy, low-hanging fruit. It's like he's such a bad president that even the jokes that are made about him are bad. But it feels particularly stale here because of how desperate they are to get a laugh out of you. They try to make him look as gross as possible and it just comes across as really cringy. Not in that the visuals are vulgar and crass, but that they really want you to find this funny and are hellbent on shoving it in your face. They will not stop making Trump jokes until you laugh at least one of them, but that's not gonna happen because none of them are funny. Their attempts to get a reaction from you are so shallow and static and you just want them to try something else. It's the most textbook examples of how people mock him, so the vast majority of jokes in this episode are just repetitive and a waste of screen time. Honestly, this episode would have really benefited from praising Trump instead of mocking him. It would still be stupid, but at least it would be something different. You could make fun of his supporters or his political opponents or even his detractors in some way. Just something different. It's like this entire episode is just one single joke being told over and over and over again. Look, America, this is the guy that you elected into the White House. Don't you feel stupid for allowing this to happen? And even when they do jokes that aren't Trump related, it still feels tasteless and empty. There's obviously a lot of political jokes and attempts at commentary in this episode, and none of it lands. They're trying to be relevant with this humor, but there's nothing relevant about it because these kind of jokes were already being made years ago and wore out their welcome by the time the episode came out. And I know this because the episode had to be written before it was voice acted and animated. Animating an episode of Family Guy, as hard as it is to believe because the animation quality of the later seasons is so terrible, actually takes a lot of time. A single episode can take several months, even a whole year to animate. And that's before factoring in the sound design and music. This episode came out in January 2019, but they were making these jokes in 2018. And even then they were getting tiresome. And that's why the attempt at being relevant doesn't work here, because the production time of the episode guaranteed that it would be irrelevant by the time it finally came out. In comparison, South Park is able to do this better because their animation quality guarantees that they'll be able to quickly cover current events, almost as soon as the topic comes to light. When the 2016 election didn't meet the story layout they had for the season, they were able to quickly change the direction of the story and produce the episodes in due time. This is because South Park's animation quality is very, very low. But that's what makes South Park more suitable for this than Family Guy. Their commentary is more relevant because they're able to quickly catch up with what's going on. Also, South Park was built from the ground up to be entirely about social commentary, so they have more experience in this field. Family Guy was not made from the ground up to be about social commentary, so it feels like they're just randomly jumping into this topic because mocking Trump and modern politics is popular, and the attempts at commentary are really bad. They briefly reference things like the Russians or Grover Cleveland or the people the previous presidents had sex with, and they don't do anything with any of these references. It's all just a series of random jokes and skits that are very loosely tied together, and a lot of them go by so fast that you wonder what the punchline was even supposed to be. Like the one with Peter taking questions. He's just pointing out clones of himself with a mustache or a weird hat. It has no connection with anything else going on, so it's just pointless filler. The jokes also feel too exclusive. The episode is about politics and people associated with Trump, right? So you have to know who these people are and do research on them to understand any of the jokes. Like, imagine if for some reason you're watching this episode and you don't know anything about Trump or any of these political figures. Chances are you're gonna get lost. You don't know anything about them, so you don't know what you're supposed to find funny. And even if you are familiar with these people or any of the stuff that they did, it's still too lazy because they're not coming up with any new material to make jokes about any of them. Even when they try to do something else, it just feels really tone deaf and drags out for way too long. There's one in particular where they just cut to Peter in the middle of a political debate where he does nothing but yell random statements. There's no rhyme or reason to it, and it just comes out of nowhere. It's so witless and forced, like they could have come up with something clever but were too lazy to put the effort into it. Not to mention that they start this off by explaining what the joke is. You know, the thing that pretty much guarantees a joke to not be funny.
If you have to explain a joke, there is no joke!
And modern Family Guy does this a lot. Explaining the joke is such a pretentious method of communicating with the audience. Like you think they're not smart enough to understand what the joke is unless you blatantly spell it out for them. And they do this twice, with a TV gag where they literally spell out what the joke is before they actually deliver it. They say it's Pirates of the Caribbean with the mic too close to the jangling bracelets, and that's all it is. Just reenacting a scene from the movie with an annoying jangling sound over the audio. It's another joke that has nothing to do with anything that they put into the episode specifically to pad out its runtime. And it's all made even worse by how the flow of the episode is being broken up by these horrible cutaway gags. These are some of the worst cutaways I have ever seen on this show. Not only are they pointless non sequiturs, but the cutaways themselves are just confusing with no wit to them. I mean, a cowboy in a Chinese Starbucks, closed captions hating on the Sleepy Hollow guy, Peter attending a Billy Joel concert. Family Guy has always had cutaway gags in them, but these ones are just abrupt. There's no method to them. They just interrupt the flow of the episode. And the jokes they tell with them aren't funny because the format is so derivative of anything clever. Just something to play with your expectations. The cowboy in the Starbucks, Peter at the concert, the closed captions making fun of Sleepy Hollow, they all play out exactly as you expect them to. You know what the joke is going to be before they even show it, so it doesn't work because it doesn't catch you off guard. The Sleepy Hollow one being the worst of the three, as they literally just take a clip from the show and have it sit there for a full 36 seconds. Just 36 seconds of nothing. It's not automatically clever just because you put some silly captions over it. This is like a 3-year-old's idea of good comedy, not grown adults with functioning brains who are being paid to make this show. And it all results in the actual story being horribly paced. It has this simultaneous problem of being painfully slow and rushed beyond belief. So much of the episode is dedicated to filler and non sequiturs that half the time you forget that there's even supposed to be a story going on. Like the part where they just randomly cut to Trump sexually harassing Meg and gets caught. There's no build-up, they just cut to it. It is literally so bad that the actual storyline of the episode, when you cut out the pointless filler and cutaways, is less than 9 minutes long. I actually counted. It's 8 minutes and 48.5 seconds. Less than 50% of the episode's runtime has any real story to it. The fight between Peter and Trump is just a means to fill up the rest of the 20 minutes because they know they have no story left at this point. and the fight itself is just boring and ludicrous. I just find it really hard to believe that Trump would be evenly matched with Peter after the toughness he presents in his fights with the giant chicken. If this Trump is supposed to be anything like the real-world version, which this episode is constantly mocking, then he shouldn't be on Peter's level. He's way too out of shape and he's too arrogant to outthink his opponent in a fist fight. And it's not even visually creative compared to the other chicken fights. The chicken fights in previous episodes had a bunch of different locations and settings to have the fight take place. It helped to add a sense of exhilaration and good humor to the fights, because the changes in location added scope to the battle, and the writers were able to use the environments to make clever gags. But this fight just takes place in a single location. It's all at Washington, D.C., which not only limits the scope, but also the kind of jokes they can tell with Peter fighting his opponent. Even the fight between Peter and Homer took them outside of Springfield, and the energy in this one just feels restrained. Normally these fights have more energy and dynamism put into them, but this one is lacking in both of those fields. With the limited scope and opportunity for jokes and the fight just being used as an excuse to force feed more Trump jokes, it has no sense of adrenaline or urgency. And it all leads up to this preachy moment where they try to tell the difference between Family Guy and Donald Trump, by saying one is just a cartoon and the other is the president. I've seen Family Guy do this meta-bit thing a lot in later seasons, and this is probably the worst of them all, specifically because it's trying to ham fist more anti-Trump sentiment at the last minute when it got old 10 minutes ago, while also making a comparison that doesn't make sense. You clearly wanted to be taken seriously with your points on how much of a joke Trump is, but now you're saying that you're just a work of fiction that can just be ignored. So are we supposed to ignore the statements you've been making about Trump and the people associated with him? It might not have been so bad, except the way they do it feels way too specific. They really seem to be going on about how they're just a work of fiction that isn't real, that doesn't have an effect on the real world, so they shouldn't be taken as seriously as stuff going on in the real world. No, please don't do that. That's what every hack on Twitter and DeviantArt and YouTube says when trying to defend a piece of media they personally like or have a soft spot for when it's being subjected to harsh criticism that makes them feel uncomfortable. If works of fiction shouldn't be taken seriously because they're not real, then Star Wars wouldn't be a cultural phenomenon that people are still talking about over 40 years later. And we wouldn't be reflecting on the cultural impact that The Simpsons made during the 90s. I get the notion that we can't just ignore how Trump is an irresponsible leader unfit to be in charge of a country, but why did we need this 21 minutes of nothing to tell us this? If you're just a cartoon, then why are you trying to be taken so seriously in all of your commentary on Donald Trump throughout this episode? And that's another thing about this episode that utterly kills the comedy. It's really desperate to be taken seriously in all the ways that it's saying, this is the guy you voted into office, America, and you should feel bad for allowing this to happen. Maybe if you were smarter with the way you wrote this episode, your statement would hold more water. You could have done something more interesting with your so-called commentary, but just decided to fill it with nothing. It's just 20 minutes of insert Trump joke here. This episode shows just how truly desperate the show has become, trying to reach for anything for some kind of relevance. It's forced and dull, with bad storytelling and jokes, and uninspired pop culture references to boot, where they just reference Star Wars because it exists. Like that's the only reason this reference is in the episode. And they also do the same thing with Geico. Oh, and they also took another shot at Bob's Burgers for being a better show than them, because that's not petty at all. If Bob's Burgers looks like it was animated in a moving car, then your show looks like it was animated in an icebox, by a turtle with the art skill of a 12-year-old on DeviantArt. Making fun of a show that's better than yours is not only bitter, but also a clear sign of incompetence. And you really seem to like showing how bitter and incompetent you are. South Park has the right to make fun of you because their show is a dozen times superior to yours. And if you really wanted to make a serious statement, then why did you end the episode saying you changed 0 minds? You're basically saying that this whole episode was pointless, because just about everything in this episode was pointless. The horrible commentary, the watered down chicken fight, the cutaways and filler, and the endless cavalcade of horrible Trump jokes that were run into the ground long before you even started production on this episode. And no, acknowledging how they're behind on these Trump jokes at the end of the previous episode doesn't make it better. If anything, they're further acknowledging how pointless the episode is because the premise they're using for jokes has long since worn off its novelty. Alright, I think it's time to wrap this up. This really is one of the worst episodes of Family Guy ever made. Not a single joke was successful or stuck the landing in any way. I was just bored out of my mind with this one because it had nothing fresh in the commentary or storytelling. It's a hollow waste of time that has nothing of value to say, and it knows it. The way they went after Donald Trump in this episode wasn't original or funny, just cringe-inducing. Like a bad Adam Sandler movie levels of cringe. The plot is practically non-existent as it takes a backseat to an abundance of badly paced, badly timed, and badly delivered jokes that are either failing to be relevant or just stalling for time until they're ready to resume the flimsy plot involving Meg getting abused for the 15,000th time. And I get that some people will say that you could easily say this stuff about any other episode of the show. So what about this one makes it the worst episode I've seen? Well, it is true that you could say that stuff about any other episode, but I feel like what separates this episode from all the others that people would consider the worst is that this one has absolutely zero effort put into it. Even the worst, most horribly written episodes I've seen from this show had some sort of resemblance of effort being put into them. Even the tiniest, smallest, flimsiest, microscopic bit of effort can still be found in those episodes. This is the only episode I can think of where they truly put no effort into it, because Trump jokes don't need effort. I know there are people who will say episodes like Screams of Silence, or Herbie the Love Sore, or Life of Brian, or other episodes I don't have time to mention are worse, and I completely understand why they would feel that way. In a way, I do feel like I should think those episodes are worse for how emotionally manipulative they are. Especially episodes that try to get you to sympathize with modern Brian. Episodes like the one where he gets driven out of town for sending an offensive tweet. I get they were trying to send a message about how social media and hate mobs on the internet can end up messing up a person's life, but they did it in all the wrong ways. Particularly because of the characters they chose to send that message. And they spend the rest of the episode going, don't you feel sorry for modern Brian? Don't you feel bad that he was driven out of his home to live in a cruddy apartment and forced to be separated from his family? No. I don't feel sorry for this piece of shit. He deserves all the horrible stuff that happens to him in this episode. But as horrible as those episodes are, they at least had a more unique concept. This episode is just another wannabe anti-Trump fest, trying to be in with the likes of all those late night shows and horribly made skit shows and cartoons attacking Trump, milking the hate for him for all it's worth before he leaves the White House. There is absolutely no new material anywhere at any point in this shit fest. They could have come up with a more interesting way to tackle the subject matter, look for new attack points to make jokes out of, at least try to mock him in a way that's more clever, but instead, they took the cheapest avenue they could have possibly gone with. It's not smart commentary. It's easily forgettable trash that can be piled up with all the other horribly written garbage this show has put out over the last decade, because they put zero effort into this episode. Because you don't have to try to make fun of Donald Trump. I get why people like to hate on him, I really do. He's a terrible president who doesn't know how to properly run a country or respond to a global pandemic, and the recent attack on the Capitol has understandably rejuvenated hate for him and his presidency. But using him as a backpedal for easy jokes and easy comedy did nothing to help the situation. If anything, the constant Trump jokes have sabotaged comedy in a way that will take years to recover from. And over the last few years, talking about him just became so inescapable and so overwhelming that it's just become a tiring topic to think about. And this episode just solidifies how irrelevant he'll become now that his presidency is over. I can think of worst episodes of Family Guy where I felt at least something watching them, whether it be frustration or annoyance. But this is the only episode I can think of that left me feeling nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everything about this episode is so painfully dated and it just feels like another pathetic attempt from the show to get ratings. It's nothing more than a shining example of how needlessly political our media has become. You can easily tell they didn't even try with this one. And for a show that actually did try in the past and used to succeed at being great, this episode just comes across as insulting. For me, this is the worst episode of the show because it marks the point in the franchise where they blatantly tell you that it will never again be the clever, lighthearted comedy it once was. All the things that made the first 6 seasons so memorable and entertaining are completely gone. The well-paced stories, fun characters, lighthearted tone, and clever comedic writing have all been sucked out of the franchise, replaced with lazy animation, horribly paced plots, bastardized characters, excessive gross-out and gore, and pointless edgy shock value that adds nothing to the story. It used to be so great with all sorts of beloved episodes, and I regret never being able to appreciate that when I was younger. This show used to be so amazing, and seeing it devolve into such unrecognizable cancer is legitimately depressing. Rewatching earlier seasons of this show is like returning to the ruins of a childhood home that got burnt to the ground. Now it's just a grotesque parody of its original concept. I have never seen a show suffer from seasonal rot as badly as Family Guy has. Perhaps it was never as respected as The Simpsons, but it was still a unique animated sitcom with an innocent charm, fun characters you wanted to spend time with, clever comedy, and good storylines that felt genuine. Things that have been sadly lost in the modern era of the show. where the writers have practically burned out any good ideas but aren't allowed to end it because Fox is a scummy corporation, so they're forced to keep it going as they milk this rotting corpse for all it's worth, turning the show into a compilation of repetitive gross-out, lazy comedy, pointless shock value, horrible monstrous characters, and then putting nothing meaningful into it. I honestly feel really bad for Seth MacFarlane as he sees his creation being turned into this horrible flaming pile of poop. It's really telling that he's been trying to distance himself from the show by focusing on personal projects like The Orville, which I hope he's able to keep going strong even with this pandemic going on, because he deserves to be associated with better material than the garbage that Family Guy has devolved into. And if there's anything else that I really want to say regarding this show, all I can say is, let it die already. I know Fox doesn't want to let it go, but the people who are still watching new episodes of Family Guy, please stop watching it. Stop giving the show ratings and just put it out of its misery. And I feel like the same should be said for The Simpsons too. Just stop giving these shows ratings and let them end. I get that there are people who don't want to see these shows end because they think of them as something that was part of their lives for so long. People who grew up with them and love them too much to put them down. But when you see how horrible these shows have become, it's really for the best. I mean, look at Family Guy in particular. Look back on the show's first 6 seasons and see how amazing it used to be. All those great episodes, all those great jokes, a time when the characters were actually likable and relatable, that's the Family Guy we grew up with and loved so much. This is not the Family Guy we grew up with and loved so much. This is just a gross, unpleasant, and unamusing mess of a show desperately trying to keep itself alive. We should remember Family Guy for the show that it used to be, not for the drivel that it's turned into. Family Guy, like The Simpsons, should be remembered for how great its earlier seasons were and the great impact they had on comedy. And even then, it just feels like they've gone on for way longer than they should. And while Family Guy and The Simpsons are the most infamous examples of this, there's actually a lot of shows and franchises that are either taking too long to give their stories a proper end, or flat out refuse to do so because they want to keep milking money off of it. And that's not a good thing for any show. I like SpongeBob. I like Arthur. I like American Dad. But there's also a point where you have to say, perhaps it's time to let them rest. They've had a long journey and they deserve to have an ending. You know, one of the reasons shows like Futurama, Phineas and Ferb, Gravity Falls, Kids Next Door, Regular Show, or Adventure Time are looked back on so fondly? Because they knew when to give their shows a proper end. To give them a conclusion before overstaying their welcome. Even My Little Pony Friendship is Magic knew when it was time to end. And it's all the better for it. Shows that refuse to end and just go on forever and ever are shows that eventually lose their appeal one way or another. And it's inevitable for every show that tries to do this. Regardless of how you feel about any of these shows, that's a fact. There's always going to be that point of no return where the end result is the audience going, look, you've gone on for so long and you've allowed your story to drag out so much that we just don't care anymore and we just want it to be over. And Family Guy and The Simpsons are proof of why that's the case. They were once beloved shows, now long past their prime, but still going because the corporations that own them see them as nothing but moneymakers, soulless and devoid of life, with nothing salvageable left, showing how it's better to eventually die than to live on forever.